that I've had the honor, committee meeting that I've had the honor of participating in and chairing. Can you all hear me?
No.
No.
Let's see. Well, I'm from New York, so I can speak louder. Does that work well?
Yes.
Great. My name is Stephen Hauser. I'm from the University of California, San Francisco. I'm a neurologist and a geneticist, and am delighted to be here at the Research Advisory Committee meeting. And I hope that later this morning, each of our members will introduce themselves in greater detail, as I will. But I am honored to present Bob McDonald, Secretary McDonald, who will open today's new meeting of the Research Advisory Committee. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Steve. I am thrilled to be here, and I'm thrilled to have everyone here in this meeting. My first statement is one of thanks. I want to thank all of you for being here. I want to thank Steve for being willing to.
Listen, no one said anything, Matt.
So, I want to thank Steve for being willing to chair the committee. I also want to thank all the veterans in the room. I want to thank you for your service, and thank you for your commitment and contributions to making life better for veterans. You know, VA research is really a staple of what we do. It's important for our veterans, and it's important for all Americans. So your work, this committee's work, is of absolute paramount importance. And I just want to thank you for that. I'm thrilled that Steve agreed to become chair. He and I had a wonderful time together when we were together in San Francisco a few months ago, and he taught me a lot just in that short lunch that we had. And I was thrilled that he was willing to chair this organization. I want to thank Francis Perez-Wilhite. Thank you, Francis, for coming on. I want to thank Dr. Scott Young, Navy veteran flight surgeon, and I want to thank Beatrice Quillam, who's on the phone with us from UC San Diego. Thank you, Beatrice. The key points again is it's really about research. We spend about $1.8 billion a year on research to VA. I frankly think that number is too low, but that's what our current spending is. I think we should be spending more, but that research has resulted in amazing breakthroughs for not only veterans, but for the American population. Did you realize we were the first to do a liver transplant? We were the first to do an implantable pacemaker. It was a VA clinician, nurse, that came up with the idea of using barcodes to connect patient records and patients and medicine. It was VA doctors that invented the shingles vaccine. I could go on and on and on. The point is that this research that we do is so critically important to the future of American medicine, and it benefits our veterans. So we've got to make sure that we continue that work. You know, it was a VA doctor that came up with the idea of an aspirin a day reducing the risk in patients with unstable angina and help license, as I said, the shingles vaccine. So this work is critically important to our veterans, it's critically important to American medicine, and critically important to the American public in general. I want to talk for a minute about the reorganization we're currently going through in the VA. We call it My VA, and there are 5 strategies. Strategy number 1 is to improve the veteran's experience. We know that our only goal in life is to care for veterans. There are 23 veterans in the country. There are about 9 million signed up for our healthcare system. We need to make sure that every veteran experience is an outstanding experience. Every day the veterans use our system. We're working with the very best companies in the private sector to improve our veteran experience. Companies like Disney, like Starbucks, like Ritz-Carlton, and we want to improve that system. Secondly, employee experience. We have no hope of improving the veteran experience unless we improve the employee experience. So we're working hard to work with our union leadership and others to make sure every employee understands that we're counting on them to be the change that they want to see, to change the systems that aren't working, to improve our culture, and to take responsibility for that veteran experience. Third is to improve our internal support systems. As many of you know, our IT systems have not been that good. This is an example of one of the systems we're working on. Our scheduling system dates back to 1985. Looks like a green screen MS-DOS kind of system. So we need to improve our systems. Fourth, we want to create a culture of continuous improvement, and we've chosen Lean Six Sigma as a culture changer to do that. Lean Six Sigma being a total quality technique. Last but not least is strategic partnerships. We know there are a lot of people out there who want to help us. We want to embrace those strategic partners. We see them as force multipliers. They can help us do more than we can do by ourselves. But importantly, there are also 50% of veterans who got less than honorable discharges that by law we cannot serve. Our partners can do that, and I think we have a moral obligation to work with these partners. This work that we're doing as a committee is critically important. As I was talking with Steve on the way down, what occurred in 2014, the crisis that occurred in 2014, was not a result of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars or Iraqi and Afghanistan veterans. It was a result of Vietnam veterans who were getting to be 60 years old or older. In the year 1975, the year I graduated from West Point, we had 2 million veterans over the age of 65. In 2017, we're going to have 10 million veterans over the age of 65. That's put a huge demand on our system, and it demonstrates the capacity we need to start building today in order to have the capacity to serve Iraqi and Afghani veterans and all veterans in the future. That's why we put together a budget, which is a large 7.5% increase that we've asked for from the House, and that's the discretionary part, from the House and the Senate. It's the closest our budget's ever been to the budget that has been put out by veteran service organizations. And I'm going to be testifying in front of the Senate Appropriations Committee tomorrow about that budget. We're good as a country in preparing people for war. What we're not as good at yet is caring for the people after the war. We want to be a VA that does that works with the President, who's a great supporter of veterans issues, and veteran service organizations, both houses of Congress, to make sure we're ready. We need to be ready. So to keep serving veterans better, we need this committee's clear, concise, and actionable recommendations. We look to you to help us focus on what elements of research we need to take on. Just last year, we received 2 reports from the IOM, one on the long-term effects of blast exposures, another on multi-symptom illnesses of Gulf War veterans. We're already incorporating the practices recommended from these reports, so what you do makes a huge difference on what we do. I appreciate the work you're doing to run down available information on brain cancer in Gulf War veterans. I'm hoping we can come together on that very soon. I look forward to seeing that in the next few months. Along these same lines, we're looking forward to outcomes and recommendations from 2 more important studies from the IOM. One IOM study updates Gulf War effects, focusing on neurological disorders, cancer, especially brain and lung cancer, and multi-symptom illnesses. Also recommendations on how we can best design epidemiological studies for multiple sclerosis and neurological disorders. I'm excited, I'm always excited, and frankly amazed by the incredible work that VA does every day. It's a privilege for all of us and a tremendous honor to serve those who have served. And I'm particularly excited about the work this committee is doing and will do under Steve's leadership and the leadership of all of you who are here. So anything I can do to help, please don't hesitate to let me know. My email address is bob.mcdonald@va.gov, and my cell phone number is on the internet. Feel free to call me.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
I'd be happy to take any questions that any of y'all have. Questions, comments, reactions? Jim?
Just keep working hard.
Yeah, keep Ron's right there, I see him. Did you purposely leave that chair open? So Ron, so I can see Ron?
No, sir, the plug-ins are right below the chair.
Okay. Well, Ron and I go way back to both being members of the 1st of the 504th Airborne Infantry.
I'm
Once
sorry,
you're,
505?
There we go. Once you're a member of the Strike Hold, you're always a member of the Strike Hold.
I just thought it was people working on a good airplanes in place.
I won't repeat what he said. He talked disparagingly about soldiers who jump out of airplanes with parachutes.
No, I can take a special good care to do that.
Thank you. Other questions, comments, reactions? Carolyn, are you next?
Yes.
Thank you. I'll leave you to your work. Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Take care.
Is this on? Oh, yes. Just like it's supposed to. Good morning, everyone. I'm Carolyn Clancy, the Interim Undersecretary for Health, and I actually want to reinforce with as much gusto as possible Bob's thanks to all the members of the committee, and also welcome the new members. I had the privilege of spending a couple of hours with Dr. Hauser a couple of months ago, and I think he's going to do an outstanding job as the chair of this group. Dr. Cranswell, I look forward to thanking you as well. And Scott Young, I happen to know very well from my prior life, and I just know that although it's extremely early in California, he is glued to the phone right now. It turned out he was also booked to lead something else on the other side of the country, and he sent me a note to say this is what happens when you have a country that's wider than it is long. The travel was a little bit tricky. If there's the contributions you've made, which Bob just touched on at a very high level, have been incredibly important. And I also recognize, I come out of a world of research before I came to VHA a little over a year and a half ago. I recognize a couple of things. One is that getting it right and listening to stakeholders and incorporating that feedback, and even when the answers aren't always what we hope they are, is an incredibly important part of our work together. And I know that it has not always been easy and hasn't necessarily always gone incredibly well. So if there's one message I would want you to hear from Bob and from me, it's that it's a new day. For example, I don't know if Denise Nichols is here.
Yeah.
Oh, there she is. Great. So Denise Nichols, on her own initiative, contacted us and said she was coming in for the meeting, and I would guess that there are many, many others listening in, or at least following the deliberations of this committee with great interest. And she helped us organize a listening session, which we will be having tomorrow morning. So Denise, I want you to know that you took the initiative, but we will be establishing a new best practice. Because the one capacity that the Veterans Health Administration has is to actually make sure that any findings from research can be translated into practice seamlessly and much more rapidly. You know, what usually happens in the rest of the world is you work really, really hard on research and you publish a study, and on average it takes about 17 years from the time research starts to the time it is actually used to benefit patient care. And of course, not all research pays off, but I'm talking about the findings that actually can be used for the benefit of patients. At VHA, we have the opportunity, and often do, although we still have to learn how to create that well-oiled machine in a very seamless, repeatable way. But we have the capacity, like no other system in the country, to make sure that the recommendations that you make and the studies that are done where there are actionable findings actually get translated to the benefit of the men and women who served in the Gulf War as well as other wars. So hear it from me, this is our strong commitment going forward. One thing I have learned in the past several years, both as a result of my prior job, I would say the past 5 years or so, as well as serving on the board of the Patient-Centered Outcomes Research Institute, is that what can feel like tension between stakeholders who are really avid and want answers now, and scientists who know that they want answers now too, but science and doing it well can take some time, is actually a very, very healthy creative tension. Sometimes it's extremely noisy and even a little bit messy. That's okay, because our shared commitment to getting it right for people who served in these conflicts, I think will help us rise above all. And again, I just want to say that it is a new day. I want to thank Ron Brown and others who have been tireless in their efforts on behalf of Gulf War veterans, and for keeping us informed about what people are concerned about. Sometimes that's a scientific question, sometimes it's just we could have been communicating more clearly. They're all really, really important. So, again, just want to thank you for your efforts. Happy to answer any questions, and looking forward to our session tomorrow morning, Denise. And I'm thinking next time we might actually need a larger room, like maybe even this one. But next time we won't have to wait for you to have the idea, because learning from you, we will be moving forward. So I'll stop there, and I know you have a very, very busy day ahead of you.
Thank you, Kevin.
Next question. Dr. Clancy, thank you, and I just want to say that it's very encouraging to see senior VA leadership here at 2 meetings in a row. And this is very encouraging to Gulf War veterans, but also to the committee, who's worked very hard to get all this information out of the research that's happening and to make recommendations for future research. One of the things we've done is put out this recent report. We're talking about translation of results to the clinical side. What I would suggest is that we take these reports that we have many, many copies of and send to every VISN director and to every environmental health person, and we're happy to coordinate that if we have the approval of senior leadership to do that.
Well, as it happens, we are having a strategic planning summit next week, and a lot of that's going to be about how do we make the transition from being a provider to both a provider and a health plan, which gives us incredibly more flexibility and resources to get veterans timely access to high-quality care, which is phenomenal. It also ups the ante on coordination of care and working in new ways with our colleagues in the community, which is a different order of business. We have, yes, been buying some care in the community for 10 to 12 years and more of it every year, especially last year. But to do it in a seamless way, particularly around a specific thematic area, whether that's Gulf War illness, whether it's hepatitis C, and so forth. The really good news, or veterans experiencing post-traumatic stress and so forth, the good news is that we have finally stood up the infrastructure to make it much easier for our colleagues in the community to take advantage of our educational offerings. I know that sounds almost silly, but it actually took some work, and now we can be confident that the expertise that's been developed here we can share much more broadly. So this particular area would fit right in that category as well. But the bottom line is, for this summit, I'll have all of the network directors and senior leaders, so I will mention it there, and we'll figure out what the logical next steps are to sort of make this happen.
That would be very helpful. There's so many really good primary care caregivers within the VA, but many times Gulf War veterans go and they say, I have no idea about this illness, I don't know anything. And so this is just another way to try and get them educated on this issue.
No, it's a
Thank you
very
very much
important
for
point.
considering this.
One thing I've learned in the past 9 or 10 months is exactly what you just said. Very loud and clear. I get a lot of emails from veterans. Not all of them are from Ron. I'm kidding you, Ron. But I've heard the story too many times that I have got a great primary care clinician, but they don't know what a risk is.
Exactly.
Or they've actually said to me, I don't know enough about this illness, so we're working on this one as well. Well, I'm going to take Dr. Young's book, so I'm hoping that we can get to another copy.
Outstanding. Well, thank you, Carolyn. And
He's laughing. I've done it before.
well, I'm very appreciative to Bob and Carolyn for the nice things that they said about me. I'm certainly going to now disappoint you all, but I will do my best to make that as minimal as possible. And we have about 20 minutes. And since this is really a new era for the Research Advisory Committee, I'd like to start with some introductions to the reintroducing for the new members, for Francis and for me, perhaps more than for anyone else, our purpose. And then just a few biographical words about each of the committee members. And I'd ask each of you to be ready just to introduce yourself for a few minutes. I have our charter in front of us, in front of me. And let me just read the scope of activity for the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses. The Department of Veterans Affairs, VA Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Veterans Illnesses, provides advice and makes recommendations to the Secretary of Veterans Affairs on proposed research studies, plans, and strategies related to understanding and treating the health consequences, all health consequences, of military service in the Southwest Asia Theater of Operations during the 1990-1991 Gulf War, Operations Desert Shield and Desert Storm. We shall meet in public session to review and advise the Secretary about VA-funded research relevant to understanding and treating consequences of military service during this Gulf War. The processes conducted to solicit, review, and select VA-funded research, and methods, results, and implications of the research. So the rest of the charter is available for people who want to read it, but to me that is the core of what we are supposed to do. I am, as I said before, an internist, a neurologist, and a geneticist. My interest is in immunology. I've worked in multiple sclerosis for a very long time, and I have led for more than 2 decades what is now the largest research program in neurology, the largest department, the research department of neurology in the United States. I think that to begin with a comment that the Secretary made this morning that resonated with me in particular. I wrote down that he said we need clear, concise, and actionable recommendations. And as someone who is not expert in all of the consequences of the Gulf War, and has not served myself, it is nonetheless clear to me from service chairing 2 of the Institute of Medicine committees and reviewing at least the literature that ideas from 2008, from 2012, and now from 2014 run parallel. There are parallel themes and priorities that have not yet been become actionable, as the Secretary asks. And I wonder if one of our goals, picking up on the Secretary's request to be concise and focus on actionable things, that over these next couple of meetings that we review the common areas of agreement and areas that people think are the low-hanging fruit where we can make an impact. And then in a very clear way try to push a few areas that the committee members and the public think are most important in terms of making an effort to satisfy the mission that we've been given in the charter. The stakes are very high. And maybe if we can find a few actionable priorities, we could make an even bigger difference. As a physician scientist, I know that we always have to be working in 2 areas together. We want to be understanding the very basic cause of terrible health problems, and certainly the outcomes from the first Mideast war have resulted in terrible problems for our veterans. We need to understand the fundamental cause of those problems, and we need to be the toughest critics of data and evidence as we're doing that, because that's the way to get the right answer. That's the scientific goal, but at the same time, we have people suffering today. And we need also to be moving with whatever evidence we have today to implement the best possible improvements for care for people who are suffering. And I think for many chronic medical illnesses, that's the goal. The basic research, which must be very rigorous, and the bedside improvements, which must be today. They also, as Dr. Clancy mentioned, should support, nurture, and accelerate the trajectories of each. The rubber meets the road when the ideas in the laboratory are tested at the bedside. The only real model for a human illness is the human illness. Dr. Clancy spoke about getting it right, and I think our biggest challenge is to try to get it right on both of these, in both of these areas, in the basic research and in what should be deployed for people today, and what research priorities should we have. So I mentioned earlier that I didn't serve. My dad was an Army paratrooper, injured Army paratrooper in World War II, like the Secretary. Many in my family have already served. And for me personally, this is a huge honor. And I hope to be able to give back, even though I can't, at this stage in my life, replace the service that I never gave, maybe giving a little bit of service in this way. So those are my comments. I am also available by email for your questions and suggestions, and I will leave that up. But it's basically Stephen.Hauser@neurology or Stephen.Hauser@ucsf.edu. So let me ask Kimberly Sullivan, to reintroduce yourself next.
Everyone, I'm Kimberly Sullivan. I am the Associate Scientific Director for the committee, and I've also been a Gulf War illness researcher since the mid-1990s. I'm trained as a behavioral neuroscientist. My current studies are a Gulf War illness consortium study, a multi-site study that we've been funded through the Department of Defense to run, and we're very, very excited to get it up and running. We have animal models and human models, and we're starting to do some treatment trials as well, of intranasal insulin, as well as some others that we're going to work. So I've been doing this work for a very long time, and I'm always grateful to the veterans who are willing to do these studies for us. You know, I always say that they don't happen if you folks don't come and do this for us, so thank you very much for your time, veterans, for doing our studies.
I'm Nancy Klimas. I'm a clinical immunologist from the Miami VA and the Southeastern University. At the university setting, we have created a multidisciplinary research team, 8 of which also serve within the VA as investigators in the VA. And we have funding from the VA to do research. We have an interesting group, a clinical team, in clinical care. I run the clinic, the Gulf War Clinic at the VA, among other things. We have immunology, endocrinology, autonomics, genomics, all covered. The glue that glues it together is the computational biology group, which delivers to us models and therapeutic targets that we can then use as our translational medicine focus. So it's a very exciting team. We're at that translational medicine place now. We're very, very excited at the momentum of the science that's actually coming to deliver care to the patients. So it's great to represent the team. Although I think I'm here mainly as a clinician because I care for a lot of Gulf War illness patients, and I see their suffering, and I am here to say this is one wicked bad illness, and that we have to do everything we can to see these folks get to effective therapy.
Jim Bunker, Director for the National Gulf War Resource Center that represents Gulf War veterans. A Gulf War guinea pig and involved with the VA and hope fraud and everything else since 1992 when the Army 72 were picked to be in it. I'm the veteran that Colonel Gamers referred to as on that 260th Battalion and was medevaced out. I'm one of the lucky persons who went to an evac hospital with all the symptoms they called Gulf War illness, but there wasn't anything called anything like that, and still have a medical records from the evac hospital in the desert. And one of the few who probably ever will. And all that, and suffering from this ever since. Been suffering with this ever since. And I came in to talk about this to the ILM just recently, and that. And I hope we can get a lot of things taken care of with this and focus, especially some of the problems that these veterans have. That's what I'll keep driving on anyways.
Hi, I'm Fiona Crawford. I'm at the Ross Kemp Institute in Sarasota, Florida, and also the Tampa VA. The Ross Kemp Institute is historically best known for its Alzheimer's research. Myself and other members of our staff there were part of the team that identified the first genetic causes of Alzheimer's disease. That was 20 years ago, around about the time of the events that we're working on here today. And from that, we've taken it all the way through to having a drug in clinical trials to treat Alzheimer's disease. So following that same roadmap, we now have a very large traumatic brain injury program at the Institute and a large and growing Gulf War illness research program. And our goal is to have exactly the same successes, better successes, with those programs than we've had with our Alzheimer's research program. We want to make everything we do relevant to the clinic, relevant to the patients, and move forward and identify biomarkers and effective treatments for our Gulf War veterans.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Fran Perez Wilhite. I'm an Army officer veteran. I've been in North Carolina since I reported to Fort Bragg in 1988. I've deployed to the Middle East numerous times, and I was there during Desert Shield. And as a veteran and a businesswoman, I'm in a very unique position. I work for the state of North Carolina, and I deal with thousands of veteran business owners for the last 9 years. I help them win federal contracts. I also have a very good relationship with all the veteran service organizations throughout North Carolina and their state commanders. So literally my entire life is dealing with veterans, and I understand the importance of making sure that we're as healthy and as strong as possible to be independent citizens. I look forward to working on this committee to continue to serve my fellow veterans. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Steve Andra, and I am also a Gulf War veteran and a disabled veteran. And by training, I'm a neurosurgeon and was director of neurosurgery at Northwestern. I'm a neuroscientist with a lot of experience in the neurosciences in general. I also have served here at the VA as a senior advisor and at the White House, so I understand the policy end of this too. I currently am Senior Vice President, Chief Medical Officer of Healthcare Service Corporation, which is the parent company of 5 Blue Cross Blue Shield plans. So I also understand that big picture of population health. I'm looking forward to serving in this committee and bringing that varied perspective to this. Also want to say I have no conflicts of interest related to the VA or to Gulf War illness research.
Hi, I'm Roberta White. I'm a clinician scientist. My clinical background is in neuropsychology, and my research background is in studying the effects of chemicals on the nervous system. I worked in the VA from 1986 to 2005, and became involved in the Gulf War illness issue in the early 90s at request of VA when veterans started coming back with the illness. I directed an environmental hazard center that was funded by VA. There were 3 of these. to study the issue of Gulf War illness in the 90s and early 2000s. It was our group in Boston, the Boston Environmental Hazard Center, that first identified pesticides and nerve gas agents as causative for CNS problems in Gulf War veterans. I continue to be an interdisciplinary scientist. I work at Boston University, where I am chairman of environmental health in the School of Public Health. That department is unusual for environmental health departments in that we have a strong military research component to our department. I am also a professor and attending in neurology and a professor of neuroscience. In addition, I'm on the CDMRP Gulf War Illness Integration Research Panel and formally chaired it. So what I mostly bring, I think, to this committee is a very long history of involvement in this issue, both clinically and from a research perspective. I didn't serve in the Gulf War either, and I'm not a veteran, but I actually went to college on VA benefits because my father died as a result of his service in Korea. So I have always had a very strong affinity and feeling for veterans throughout my career and actually my life. And I would like to say one other thing, which is that Britt Sutton, our wonderful assistant, this is her last meeting. So she will be moving on to a better job. She got her MPH and stuff while she was working for us. So be sure to say goodbye to her while you're here. Thanks, Britt, for all the stuff you've done for all the meetings.
Yes, thank you.
So we are 4 minutes ahead of time, so we can.
Oh, I'm sorry, this is Dr. Bond. Don't need to introduce myself.
Oh, wonderful.
Dr. Young as well.
Fantastic.
Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Dr. Beatrice Salam. I'm a professor in the Department of Medicine at UC San Diego School of Medicine. I've been involved in Gulf War research since the 1990s, where I authored 4 of a series of 8 reports for RAND on the relation of exposure to illness in Gulf War veterans. I've personally cared for a panel of about 280 veterans for around 15 years, including many Gulf War veterans. And I am currently and in the past funded by the CDMRP to do research in Gulf War illness. I was also the original scientific director for this committee.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And
Hi,
Dr. Young?
This is
Scott Young?
This is
Sorry.
Scott Young. I'm a family practice physician. I run Kaiser Permanente's Care Management Institute. We're the folks who figure out the evidence behind our care pathways for about 10 million Kaiser Permanente members. I did gladly work for Carolyn Clancy at the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality before coming into California about 10 years ago. More importantly, before I was a family physician, I was a naval officer and a naval flight surgeon. I did deploy to the Middle East during the period of the war, and I'm just very honored to be here with you and by phone and hopefully soon in person to do this important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Vic, are there any other administrative charges to the committee or comments that you'd like to make?
Yeah, so if you have a moment, Dr. O'Leary and I, myself, will just sort of introduce ourselves too. My name is Madhu Agrawal. I'm an internist by background and currently serve as the Deputy Undersecretary for Health Policy and Services. And in that role, I oversee both public health as well as the Office of Research. But more importantly, I'm an internist who actually has worked in the VA for 20 years, taking care of veterans of all eras. And welcome you all, and thank you.
I'm Tim O'Leary, I'm Chief Research and Development Officer, and my background is in molecular genetic pathology. I also did a PhD in chemistry at Mullen University, about 30 miles south of you. My connection with third generation veterans, public health service, I was on active duty twice, didn't have to fly overseas, although many of my brothers and sisters did. And both my father and my grandfather died of service-connected conditions, so I feel very special loyalty to our veterans and to VA. I'm very interested in this program and for research. I think we've begun to stimulate some new efforts that will actually begin to see the light of day over the next few months. And I'm looking forward to your ideas and your thoughts from the school.
I'm Vic Kalasinski. I'm in the Office of Research and Development, and I'm the designated federal officer. So I'm your liaison to the VA, and spent some time as a DoD civilian, in fact, when the Gulf War started, and so I deployed over there, looking at the environmental impact of the oil fires after the shooting was over, of course. So I've been involved in various aspects of Gulf War research since 1990 myself. So, yeah, I'm looking forward to some clear, concise, and actionable recommendations. We'll put them into practice.
We will do our best.
You heard it here first.
Well, I think we have an exciting meeting planned. And the goal, since this is our first meeting, and in fact the first meeting of this committee since last fall, as the committee has reorganized. And so our goals are, I think, threefold for the next day and a half. First, to learn about some of the most impactful new research in the genetics and neurobiology area. We will focus on clinically important research at the next meeting. So we will focus more on the basic science this meeting. And I've asked both speakers, as has Bobby White, to please present the new findings in the context of the body of knowledge prior to these findings, so that we can understand exactly how this moves the field forward. The second goal of the meeting is to review together the current portfolios of research that are underway relevant to the VA, relevant to the VA RAC committee's job. And then the third will be to begin to pull together an agenda for goals for this year, which ends this federal year, we call it an academic year, ends September 30th. So what can we accomplish by September 30th? And as part of that, we would hope to have 2 additional meetings prior to September 30th. And in addition to scheduling those meetings, I hope that before we are finished, to be sure that we are all in agreement on the meeting dates, that we can begin to move for the 2016 meetings so that we're way ahead of time. Because I've understood that that has been a challenge for the RAC committee in the past. The meetings have been scheduled like this one at the very last minute. So we hope not to replicate that down the road. So to begin, Kim, would you like to introduce Dr. Steele?
Yes, it would be my pleasure. We've asked Dr. Steele to come this morning and talk about her recent research looking at gene exposure outcomes in Gulf War illness. And she is our past scientific director and a committee member who just recently rotated off, so anybody who's been here for some time knows Dr. Steele. Just to give you a little bit of background, she is a research professor of biomedical studies at Baylor University, where she directs the Veterans Health Research Program. And this is focused on complex health conditions affecting war veterans. She's an epidemiologist and human ecologist whose research has focused on the health consequences of military service, primarily in 1991 Gulf War veterans. And she also ran the Kansas Persian Gulf War Health Initiative for the state of Kansas, and was the principal investigator of the Kansas Gulf War Health Study. So Welcome, Dr. Steve.
Thank you, Dr. Sullivan. Is this on? Yes. Okay.
Yep.
Well, you know, it's a pleasure to be here, may I say. I've been coming to nearly every RAC meeting since 2002, and I am doing a remembrance of the RAC for our colleague Jim Binns. I was reflecting on the history of the RAC. It actually began in April of 2002. So this is the 13th anniversary of the RAC. And it's also, we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of Operation Desert Shield. So that's, you know, sort of a magnanimous anniversary, and we're still working on it, just to share with the veterans here. So I also, before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the great work of the researchers on the panel that have done so much already to help us better understand Gulf War illness and the other health problems affecting Gulf War veterans. So this is Dr. Sullivan, Dr. Klimas, Dr. Crawford, and Dr. Galome, and Dr. White. So glad to still be here with you. All right, so I was asked to come today to talk about a recent paper that we published from Baylor, and this paper provides preliminary evidence of a gene exposure interaction in 1991 Gulf War veterans, and specifically relates to butyrylcholinesterase. Okay, so we'll use the arrow here so that it gets on the screen. So. And mindful of there being new committee members and folks who may not have read cover to cover all of the previous RAC reports and all the other research related to Gulf War illness and Gulf War veterans, I will try to provide this information in the context of what we know from previous research on Gulf War illness and why would we be looking at this particular gene exposure and interaction. So let's just start. As I said, we're coming up on the 25th anniversary of Operation Desert Shield. August 2nd, 1990 is when the initial invasion occurred. And as most people here know, we had the troop buildup in the desert, and then by January 16th of 1991, the actual war began with airstrikes. That was the beginning of Operation Desert Storm. The airstrikes went on for about 5 or 6 weeks before the ground combat began in February of 1991. The ground combat then occurred for just 4 days when a ceasefire was declared. So this was a quick war, very different from the more recent deployments. About 700,000 U.S. troops served, and we won. We won decisively in short order. We had relatively few casualties from this war. And yet, despite the low number of casualties and the successful execution of the war, the troops came back with these mysterious health problems that at the time was called Gulf War syndrome by the media. Now it's more commonly referred to as Gulf War illness, and the list of symptoms I'm sure we're all familiar with. Of course, everyone wants to know what caused the problem, and I think initially, of course, because it was a war, I believe everyone just assumed it was some kind of stress of war kind of problem. But there developed over time a long list of possible contributors to what had caused this problem. The trauma and stress of war was just the first sort of idea. The oil well fires we are all familiar with, because I think a lot of us who weren't in the war watched it and saw these. Others who were there have lots and lots of stories about the density of the oil and the smoke and the darkness of the day. And just horrendous. We also know that there were chemical weapons exposures during the war. 14,000 chemical alarms are said to have gone off, and initially we understood that those were all false alarms, but as the years have gone by, we've understood that no, they probably weren't all false alarms, and that there were some detections. The most notable one happened in southeastern Iraq at a site called Qamishiyah, just after the ceasefire in early March of 1991. What you see there is the plume cloud design modeled by the Department of Defense and CIA. At this site, there were a massive munitions depot where, after the war, our troops went in to destroy the Iraqi munitions. And in the process of that, setting massive detonations across this depot, a cloud of smoke went up. And this green cloud models that cloud of smoke just for one day, swooping down over northern Saudi Arabia and into Kuwait. The little red dots are the locations where different units were. So we now know that there were chemical munitions in those in that cloud, and most particularly sarin and cyclosarin, and DoD models have suggested and estimated that as many as 100,000 troops were exposed to low levels of nerve agents just from this one incident. We also gave our troops something called pyridostigmine bromide, or PB. At the time they were called NAP pills, NAPP, nerve agent prophylaxis pyridostigmine bromide. So anyway, we now mostly call them PB. These were supposed to give them protection in the event that they were exposed to nerve agents, and subsequently we learned that they were most effective in the event of exposure to SOMAN. So now it's approved by FDA for that purpose. At the time of the Gulf War, it was more, there was given a temporary sort of IND waiver to allow PB to be given to troops in hopes that it would help protect them from the deadly effects of nerve agents. There are also a lot of exotic insects and flies and sand fleas and all kinds of things in the desert there that we know had caused serious diseases in previous deployments, and so there's a great deal of concern about that. We gave our troops a long list of all kinds of pesticides and insect repellents intended to protect them from the diseases that they may get from these insects. So this is really the short list. There were, I believe, 64 different products used during the Gulf War. These are the 15 products that DoD has identified as the pesticides of primary concern. And so you'll see there's a long list of different types of pesticides. Some of them are no longer used. For example, the 75% DEET liquid is no longer used. Lindane, which is an organochlorine, is no longer used. There's a number of others. But bottom line is Desert Storm veterans were exposed to a lot of different pesticides at high levels, far beyond what was intended on the label in terms of use of these. And DoD has actually issued a report identifying at least 40,000 troops as being overexposed to pesticides. So, as I said, the list is long of things that may have caused or contributed to Gulf War illness, and here's a list that we could add a lot of things to this list. Now, over the years of the RAC and other folks as well, there's been a great deal of effort to review all of the literature that tells us which of these factors were most important in contributing to Gulf War illness. This is a summary of the evidence from epidemiologic studies, but interestingly, the findings from epidemiologic studies are consistent with what we see in animal studies and what we see in other exposed populations. So the bottom line from the epi studies is really the bottom line in terms of the strength of evidence related to etiology of Gulf War illness. And many of the epi studies look at psychological stressors in the same way we might look at chemical exposure. So were certain traumatic experiences associated with higher rates of Gulf War illness and things like that. So when you go down this list of possible contributors, consistently the epidemiologic findings indicate that psychological stressors like serving in combat or seeing someone killed on the battlefield or something like that, evidence indicates there's no association with the rates of Gulf War illness. People with those experiences are significantly more likely to have PTSD and other psychiatric disorders, but they are not more likely to have Gulf War illness. The second group for which we have consistent findings relate to pyridostigmine bromide and pesticide exposures. These have been evaluated in lots and lots of different populations. The ones that actually controlled for confounding and did methods that we feel like we can trust the results consistently indicate a significant association between PB and Gulf War illness and pesticides and Gulf War illness, excuse me. And then for other exposures, it's more equivocal. For evidence related to low-level nerve agents, oil, smoke, number of vaccines, and combinations of exposures, it's unclear whether there's an association. The committee previously has felt that an association cannot be ruled out, and that's because the evidence is either inconsistent or it's limited in important ways. And then lastly, for that last group of exposures, there's very little evidence to support a link with Gulf War illness. Excuse me, I'm sorry. So bottom line is that the etiology of Gulf War illness appears to be complex, and it's important to evaluate health outcomes in veteran subgroups. We've learned this time and time again over the years. But looking just at the epi studies and also consistent with animal studies and other populations, The evidence most consistently implicates the PB pills and excessive use of pesticides as risk factors for Gulf War illness. And then we haven't ruled out low-level exposure to chemical weapons, oil fires, and chemical combinations. But I just want to call to your attention that the chemical risk factors of greatest concern are all neurotoxicants. So PB pills are carbamates, as are many of the pesticides. Other pesticides are organophosphates, also acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. Nerve agents are organophosphates by and large, and those are also acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. So that's the theme that we're seeing in terms of the major risk factors for Gulf War illness. So the question is then, if we see this consistent link between these exposures and Gulf War illness, for many years, many people have asked, why did some people develop Gulf War illness while others who served alongside of them and presumably had the same exposures or many of the same exposures, but they remained well during and after the Gulf War? So why might that be? So one of the prominent ideas on this over the years is that there could have been individual differences in vulnerability to the effects of these neurotoxicants, right? So we know that there are a number of circulating enzymes that protect us from adverse effects of some of these chemicals, like carbamates and organophosphates. And people have long speculated that Gulf War illness may be related in some way with genetic variability in these protective enzymes. So the most prominent one, the one for which there have been the most studies, is peroxinase. And peroxinase helps protect the body against adverse effects of many pesticides, most primarily organophosphates. There's another enzyme, though, called butyrylcholinesterase that binds acetylcholinesterase inhibitors and also protects the body from adverse effects. There's a lot to know about butyrylcholinesterase, and there has been very little research here. So we actually designed our study around butyrylcholinesterase. But just briefly, I want to share with you what we've already learned from studies of peroxinase. And here we find that there have been 4 studies in the past, and results of these studies have been, I would say, mixed, would be sort of the optimistic way to say this, because different people looked at different measures of PON1, looked in Gulf War illness defined in different ways, looked at sort of sick versus healthy veterans, and the sick veterans would be using all different kinds of case definitions, but they also would look at deployed versus non-deployed veterans, and just look to see whether any of the PON1 variables differed between sick versus healthy or deployed versus non-deployed. And I don't necessarily need to just sort of read through this with you, but the first study of this type was from Dr. Haley in 1999. He had a small study of Navy Seabees, I think 25 in that study. He said that there was the PON1 activity in a certain substrate, peroxone, was non-significantly higher in Gulf War illness cases using his case definition, but one isoenzyme, aryl esterase activity, was significantly lower in cases. Now this again was a very small sample. Then we had from the UK sample from the University of Manchester, Dr. Magnus's study. That study included 152 UK Gulf War veterans. They reported lower PON1 activity using peroxone as a substrate in deployed Gulf War veterans compared to non-deployed Gulf War veterans, but no genetic differences. But again, when you're comparing deployed to non-deployed, you wouldn't necessarily expect there to be genetic differences. Later, we had a second UK cohort looking at this question. Their definition of Gulf War illness was quite different than any of the other ones, but they also found lower enzyme activity in deployed versus non-deployed, okay? So why would that be? Did that mean that deployment to the Gulf War resulted overall in a lower enzyme activity for some reason? Well, we don't know. But again, no genetic differences. And then the most recent study came from VA, Dr. John Kincaid, and that study reported no PON1 activity differences in cases versus controls or in deployed versus non-deployed. So as you see, it's just really hard to say what this is telling us. Now let's turn to butyrylcholinesterase and our recent study. Our question here was whether Gulf War illness is associated with butyrylcholinesterase enzyme activity or with the genotype of this enzyme. This came out in Environmental Health in January. My collaborators here were a wonderful team from Midwest Research Institute in Kansas City, and also Dr. Oksana Lockridge from the University of Nebraska. She is sort of our world's expert in butyrocholinesterase, and we were thrilled to have her. And this study was funded by DoD some years ago. So let me give you a little bit of background on butyrocholinesterase. I think different physicians will have some experience with this enzyme. Those of us who pay attention to toxicology will have other experience with this enzyme. Basically, butyrocholinesterase is present in the blood, in the serum, at levels about 10 times higher than acetylcholinesterase. So although these chemicals act on acetylcholinesterase, it's actually not as prominent in the blood as a protective enzyme as butyrocholinesterase. Unfortunately, we don't completely understand what butyrocholinesterase does. We do know some things that it does, though. So it acts as a scavenger. It binds the offending chemicals molecule for molecule, just basically protecting you from that chemical because it's been bound by butyrocholinesterase. It also can hydrolyze those chemicals in some circumstances. But in any case, it provides a protective function against organophosphates, carbamates, and some other compounds. In some ways, butyrocholinesterase is our first example of pharmacogenetics because we've known since the 60s, and Dr. Lockridge and some of her colleagues were actually involved in some of this work that evolved over the years, that some patients who are given succinylcholine in relationship to surgery as part of the muscle relaxant with the anesthesia cannot tolerate succinylcholine. So when they get to succinylcholine at a level that normally would just act for a few minutes on most people, there's a subgroup of people who get a prolonged response to it. They can't metabolize the succinylcholine properly, and they can then have a response that lasts for hours, and sometimes many hours. They can get paralysis, they can be unable to breathe, they may have to be put on a ventilator, for example. So it's been known for many years that these patients have a butyrocholinesterase deficiency, and it is due to their having a slow-acting genotype for butyrocholinesterase. So we've known about that for a long time. There's one butyrocholinesterase gene, and many variations, I think about 60 have been identified so far. But the most common is the wild type, or U allele, and the second most common is K, followed by A and F, and you'll see our stats from our study, very similar to this. Those of us who are around, pesticide-exposed populations have seen that butyrocholinesterase serum activity can be a very sensitive measure for level of exposure to certain pesticides. So out in the field, sometimes people measure the blood acetylcholinesterase, and other people prefer to measure butyrocholinesterase. Because when you're exposed to pesticides in the field, your level of butyrocholinesterase goes down, and you can actually gauge the degree of exposure based on your level of butyrocholinesterase enzyme activity. So the other very interesting thing to know about butyrocholinesterase is that it is currently being developed as a prophylactic measure to protect against effects of nerve agents. So basically a safer alternative to PV. And our colleague Dr. Lockridge is one of the people working on this. So basically if you raise the level of butyrocholinesterase in the body, you will have protection against PV. Excuse me, that was a Freudian slip maybe. You'll have protection against serum. And so that's a great thing. So it also underscores the importance of the level of butyrocholinesterase for protecting against organophosphates. So is Gulf War illness associated with butyrocholinesterase? That's the question. There were a couple of studies that suggested that yes, it might be. One was just a single case report that came out of Hermonus Rex's lab. The primary authors are Lowenstein and Lichtenstein. This came out in 1995. It's a case report of an Israeli soldier who, during the Gulf War, the Israelis also took pyridostigmine bromide, the same levels that we did, 30 milligrams a day every 30 milligrams every 8 hours, so 3 times a day. So the Israelis were also taking that level. She saw a soldier who became very ill with pyridostigmine bromide and had terrible side effects and had sustained problems. He was found to be an AA homozygote for butyrocholinesterase, which would be a very at-risk profile for succinylcholine, for example. Also, she found that his butyrylcholinesterase and his family members had a very poor affinity for carbamates. So, Ding, we were thinking that this may tell us something about butyrylcholinesterase. Turned out, sorry, I had a cold. Turned out that this soldier also had problems in surgery with succeeding. So, then the second sort of suggestion that there may be a link with butyrylcholinesterase came from a DoD project that Dr. Lockridge did in 1999. She looked at Nebraska Gulf War veterans. At that time, she didn't know a lot about how you define Gulf War illness. She just asked veterans, do you have Gulf War syndrome? And for those who said yes, if they were carriers of A or F alleles for butyrylcholinesterase, 73% felt that they had Gulf War syndrome. For those who had normal butyrylcholinesterase, only 30% felt that they had Gulf War syndrome. So that was just, again, sort of an indicator that there may be a link with butyrylcholinesterase. This was never published, this just came out of her project report. But we were in Kansas when we first heard about this, so we knew Dr. Lockridge. All right, so here's the basic outline of our study. We assessed both butyrylcholinesterase enzyme activity and genotype in a population-based sample of 304 1991 Gulf War veterans. This included 144 cases by the Kansas case definition and 160 Gulf War veteran controls. We determined if Gulf War illness risk was associated with cholinergic exposures overall in this study, and then we looked to see if that risk differed by butyrylcholinesterase genotype. So when we did our butyrylcholinesterase subgroup analyses, we basically compared three big groups. One were the UUs, the most prominent genotype for butyrylcholinesterase. Then the subgroup UK, the second most common type of genotype. And then, because there were just ones and twos of all the other genotypes, we combined them together, and we called that group the less common variants group, okay, the LCVs. So basically, the UUs and the UKs had normal enzyme activity. They were very capable of metabolizing and neutralizing acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. And the less common variants had an enzyme that acted more slowly. So it was less effective at neutralizing these chemicals. So we basically started out like all the previous studies had, comparing cases to controls. And what we found was that enzyme activity in cases was similar to that of controls, and also that genotype of cases was similar to that of controls. So on the surface, it looked like there was no link between butyrylcholinesterase and Gulf War illness. Let me just briefly show you that. So as I say, the most common genotype is UU, and that was the most common here. Then UK, then KK homozygotes. And as you see, the activity levels for all veterans combined was 1.10 micromoles of benzylcholine hydrolyzed per minute. It's a measure of the activity level of the enzyme. Overall, the average was 1.10. It was higher for the UUs, about that for the UKs, and then it goes down pretty consistently, except for the UAs, in these less common variants. So when we combine the common variants, the enzyme activity is 1.13, and it's significantly higher than when we combine the uncommon variants, where it's 0.81. Now let's look at genotype. Compare, oh, I'm sorry, we're still looking at enzyme activity. So overall, for Gulf War illness cases, the 144 cases, the mean activity level was 1.10. For controls, it was also 1.10, almost identical with a slightly different standard deviation. That's, we're very proud of our population-based samples because we're able to sort of eliminate all random variation as a contributor here. So we think there was no association with case status, basically. Now let's look at genotype profile. Again, here are all the different genotypes. And here, so we have kind of a funny packet. And in the total sample, 62% were UUs, and then on down the line. Then we look at the proportion of cases that were these different genotypes, and the proportion of controls that were these different genotypes. And they are almost identical again. So basically, you know, with the few UAs, AFs, and AKFs, we just had 1 to 3 in those categories, and we basically saw that in both cases and controls. And then we combine all the less common variants together. It's a total of 10% in the cases and 9% in the controls. Again, no significant difference, no difference at all, really. So then we decided, okay, now let's drill down to look at the relationship between cholinergic exposures and Gulf War illness and see if that differed in the context of what the genotype for butyrocholinesterase was. So here we have risk factors for Gulf War illness, all the different cholinergic exposures. Taking PB pills was about 3-fold increased risk for Gulf War illness. Same with the different pesticide exposures. Except for being in an area sprayed with pesticides, our studies have consistently not found that to be a risk factor for Gulf War illness. We used hearing chemical alarms as a proxy for possible exposure to nerve agents. Again, in this study, this was not a risk factor for Gulf War illness. So this first column looks at all Gulf War veterans combined. The second column looks at UU and UK combined. This is the subgroup with the normal acting butyrocholinesterase. And you see that overall, the odds ratios related to PB, the different pesticide exposures, are similar for the full group and in the common variants here, which is 90% of the groups, so you'd expect it to be very similar. But where we found a difference was when we looked in that 10% group with the slow-acting genotypes. So here we see that for veterans who have slow-acting genotypes for butyrocholinesterase and use PB pills, the risk for Gulf War illness is 40. This is based on just 28 veterans with this less common, slow-acting butyrocholinesterase profile, but highly significant and significantly different than the other subgroups. The other exposures were not, we saw no interaction at all related to pesticide use or possible exposure to nerve agents. So the main finding here is what appears to be a significant interaction between butyrocholinesterase genotype and use of PB pills during the Gulf War. And just to see it graphically, you can see for veterans who had normal acting butyrocholinesterase, very sensitive thing. Normal acting butyrocholinesterase genotypes are associated with an odds ratio of about 3 if they use PB, which is troubling enough. But if they have the slow-acting genotypes, then they have an odds of 40-fold higher for Gulf War illness if they use PB. So, we, of course, call this preliminary indication because for a number of reasons, one, no one has looked at this elsewhere, so it's the first report of this type, but also that our sample size is not large, and so consider this a very preliminary finding. So, but it was still dramatic nonetheless. I mean, I think a lot of epidemiologists will go their whole lives and never see an odds ratio of 40 on anything, so it's quite stunning. We were concerned that it could just be a fluke in some way, perhaps having something to do with the profile of the veterans that we had in the study, or did we just happen to have a lot of folks with slow-acting butyrocholinesterase who used pyridostigmine bromide? They just all reported pyridostigmine bromide. So we actually looked at everything we could to see if there were any differences between, yes?
I just want to ask a question. In your power analysis, what population size would you need to get a statistically valid?
Well, this is a statistically valid. You could even do it with a smaller sample, but it's more about credibility and wanting to replicate in a larger sample. This is a highly significant finding. We did a Fisher's exact test, and the p-value is 0.0005.
Okay, great.
Yeah, highly significant. And actually, I put the numbers and the confidence intervals in a later slide if you want the details, but it's also in the paper. So yeah, it's highly significant. Not only is the association with PB highly significant, but the interaction itself is significant. So the bottom line is, though, that we found no differences between this subgroup and the larger population of Gulf War veterans on anything except for their butyrocholinesterase genotype. So, for example, 58% of the slow-acting butyrylcholinesterase group said that they used PB, but 57% of the larger group. So it wasn't just a fluke of over-reporting on PB, for example. We also wondered, well, maybe this is some kind of anomaly with using the Kansas case definition, that it may select sort of just for people who are more susceptible in some way in relationship to PB use. So we actually reassigned case status using, yes, ma'am.
You may have mentioned this, and I may have missed it, but your smaller your smaller sample, were those veterans, do you know if they were in the same unit or in the same location?
It was a random sample, it was a population-based sample, so it was from a certain geographical area. So they were Army, Navy, all different areas of theater. And we actually have a whole nother paper published on what the other risk factors were other than butyrylcholinesterase. So where you served is a risk factor for Gulf War illness, what branch of service you were in, and things like that. But this was just a grouping of a random sample. They weren't the same. We do have another study where they were on the same unit. So we basically reassigned case status just to make sure this wasn't an anomaly of the Kansas case definition. We also had collected data that allowed us to assign case status using the CDC chronic multi-symptom illness case definition. It's a broader case definition for those of you who haven't reviewed this information. We had a lot more cases than controls then when we reassigned case status. And here's what we found. The first column there, the first row, looks at the odds ratio for Gulf War illness in relationship to PB using the Kansas case definition. You saw that before. For fast-acting enzyme, it's 3. For slow-acting enzyme, it's 40. Using the Fukuda CDC case definition, in all Gulf War veterans, the PB is associated with a twofold increased risk for Gulf War illness, similar to the fast-acting enzyme. But for those with the slow-acting enzyme, the odds ratio is just over 11. So even though it's a broader, less specific kind of case definition, we still see that same pattern where there's an association for all veterans, but it's much more pronounced in the subgroup who have slow-acting butyrylcholinesterase genotypes. So we felt confident that this was a solid finding, at least that wasn't due to either factors related to the study or the case definition that we used. So, just to provide a little bit of context, we consider this preliminary evidence that the subgroup of Gulf War veterans with slow-acting butyrylcholinesterase genotypes were at dramatically increased risk for Gulf War illness if they used PB, but not otherwise. This is consistent with the 2 preliminary reports that I outlined for you, and also there are 2 animal studies that have identified delayed neurological effects of PB, low-dose PB exposure, but only in strains that have low butyrylcholinesterase enzyme activity. Interesting. The caveats, of course, and we always want to caution not to overinterpret findings, is that this was a relatively small sample, 304 veterans, that only include 28 with the at-risk genotypes. And also we can't really say how broadly this might have affected the larger population of Gulf War veterans. If we just wanted to sort of guesstimate based on our sample, we would say that at most it could explain about 10% of Gulf War illness cases. So, in summary, this provides preliminary evidence of a significant gene exposure interaction, saying that the subgroup of Gulf War veterans with this less effective butyrylcholinesterase, who also use PB, were at significantly greater risk for Gulf War illness compared to other veterans. This was a small sample, of course, but the association was highly significant. The point estimate for the odds ratio was very high in this subgroup. But of course, we want to see this replicated in a larger sample. I think it also identifies an issue related to analytic methods, that they're important. Basically, factors that would convey an increased genetic vulnerability to a chemical can only be evaluated in terms of whether people were exposed or not. You wouldn't expect to see risk associated with a genotype or an enzyme that was exposure dependent in people who weren't exposed. So we can talk about that a little bit more. I will say that just on a broader level, this raises a number of questions for me. We know that exposure to pesticides and other acetylcholinesterase inhibitors lowers your level of butyrylcholinesterase. in general. We know that people with these slow-acting enzymes had lower levels of butyrylcholinesterase activity during the war and since. I have wondered if perhaps people who had their butyrylcholinesterase lowered during the war because of the other acetylcholinesterase inhibitors that they were exposed to, if they may have been put at increased risk for Gulf War illness through similar mechanisms that we see in these folks with the slow-acting enzyme. The other thing I want to raise are the potential implications of this kind of finding for animal models. Different animal species have different detoxicating enzymes. Rats differ from mice, for example, and they all differ from dogs and horses and pigs. So, when we're assessing the effects of exposures in our animal models, we have to think about what enzymes they have as tools to protect them from these exposures. So, that's the big picture from my study.
Thanks very much, Lee. Why don't we open the
I'll just say that I have a little epilogue that after we have Q&A, I can, if there's still time and if there's interest. We actually have done a little bit of work with Pond 1 as well, so we can throw that in at the end or talk about
Would you like to just show that
What's
quickly?
what you think? It's something that I would usually not present at a committee meeting.
Maybe just the data?
Yeah,
Slides,
exactly.
yeah.
So, yeah, we'll do that, and I'll try and do it quickly. We actually had a separate study in a separate population that was designed for something else entirely, but that for which we actually collected some data on Pond 1 for a whole different reason than this. When we saw our findings with butyrylcholinesterase, we decided to go back and look to see whether this subgroup approach would tell us anything about the effects of Pond 1 in Gulf War veterans. So the study wasn't powered for this kind of analysis, but because our preliminary findings and those of other investigators indicate that the Pond 1 information is just confusing and not really clear at all. But no one had really looked at Pond 1 in terms of whether it put subgroups of people at increased risk for Gulf War illness based on the exposures. So, I think that our findings are interesting not only because of the specific interaction that we may have identified, but also because it may outline a new approach that we can take for understanding the relationship of genotype to Gulf War illness. So let's just talk briefly about Pond 1. Pond 1 hydrolyzes organophosphate compounds, including insecticides and nerve agents. There are two major variants that we looked at and that others have looked at. It's at position 192. The Q variant is most effective at hydrolyzing nerve agents like sarin, soman. The R variant is more effective at hydrolyzing some pesticides like pyroxan, chlorpyrifos, and parathion. And maybe other things, we don't know. We have this sample that I say that we developed for a different study entirely. It had a total N of 72. Some of the folks were non-deployed controls, so we really couldn't evaluate exposures in that group. So we ended up with a pretty small sample. And the reason that I'm sharing this with you is not so much because of the results, which are interesting, but again, too many caveats to really be able to depend on the findings. But it really shows that this approach of looking at gene exposure interaction rather than just genotypes in cases versus controls, that this approach may actually be the way to figure this out. This particular cohort was all in one unit. This was a unit that was forward deployed. They basically were all Army. They were all enlisted personnel. They all fell into units that had been under the commissary of plume. So basically these guys got, and they were almost all guys, they got exposed to pretty much everything that the Gulf War had to offer. So like 100% were exposed to oil and fire smoke. So we were interested in knowing, for a maximally exposed population, who gets Gulf War illness and who doesn't. So in this cohort, because everyone was pretty much exposed to everything, we found the only risk factors related to degree of exposure. So people who used pyridostigmine bromide for a week or longer had a higher risk for Gulf War illness, but people with shorter duration did not. Similarly with some of the pesticide exposures. So as you see, just looking at all the veterans in the sample, there was an elevated risk that was non-significant because of the sample size probably for wearing pesticide-treated uniforms, taking TB for a week or longer, The skin pesticides and chemical alarms were not risk factors in this group. But now here's the data for the PON 1. So what I'm going to show you now are the two different PON 1 subgroups. One is our QQ homozygotes. Recall that they are best at hydrolyzing nerve agents. And then the other subgroup carry at least one R allele, and they are best at hydrolyzing pesticides. So here's how it looks, and this is where, if it were a bigger sample size, we would be excited. So the QQs, for them, here in chemical alarms was not a risk factor, but the RRs and the QRs, they have at least one R allele, and they are bad at metabolizing sarin. Guess what? Those folks, we saw significant elevation in risk for Gulf War illness, just in this subgroup. And I'll put this thing up around there. So you see, so this subgroup, if they heard chemical alarms, we use that as a proxy for possible exposure to nerve agents. Their chemical alarms, they were at increased risk. The odds ratio here is nearly 8 for Gulf War illness, but the people who were QQs had no increased risk. Going down to skin pesticides, again, we don't see any significant association with Gulf War illness, but there was a non-significant increased risk for QQs, skin pesticides, and no increased risk at all for anyone with an R allele. Going down to those who wore the pesticide-treated uniforms, these tend to be the most highly exposed people to pesticides. If they wore pesticide-treated uniforms for a week or longer, they actually had significant increase in Gulf War illness risk overall. But for the QQs, the increased risk was 21, right? And you see here that's a logit estimator, and you use that when one of the cells of the analysis is 0. So basically there were no controls who were QQs and wore pesticide-treated uniforms. They were all cases. That's pretty dramatic. But for anyone with an R allele, we saw no increased risk associated with wearing pesticide-treated uniforms. Tim?
Yeah. So earlier you had referred to, for a different analysis,
Fish's exacta, which makes me wonder, have these p-values been corrected for multiple hypotheses at these points?
This is just a first dash look to see where we get.
So there's no
the more concern here is about the collinearity.
Let me comment that multiple hypothesis correction is appropriate where the first order explanation is chance. It's not necessarily appropriate, and Bonafoni is certainly excessively conservative if there's arbitrary reason for suspecting a relationship.
We consider this totally exploratory. We didn't have a hypothesis, honestly. We looked at it because of the beautiful esterase findings. So
right, but you have knowledge of which genetic variants are expected to confer more and less protection against, for example, nerve agents.
Correct. So that was why it was more interesting than just the fact that the numbers differed in the two groups, but also that they differed in the direction that we would expect for the alleles in question. Also, similar to the pesticide finding, those who took PD for a week or longer were at risk for Gulf War illness, substantially so if they were QQs, not at all if they had an R allele. And that interaction is significant as well. So again, I would not even call this preliminary evidence, I would call this exploratory evidence that suggests that there may be an association between PON 1 and Gulf War illness, specifically in subgroups that relate differently to different exposures. Recall, as Dr. Colon just said, that the R variant has a better capacity for hydrolyzing some pesticides, but poor hydrolysis of sarin. And the veterans here with the R allele were at significantly greater risk for Gulf War illness if they heard chemical alarms, but the QQ homozygotes were not. On the other side, use of pesticides and PD were significantly associated with Gulf War illness only in the QQs, not if they had R alleles. So again, exploratory only, but not only does it raise, the possibility that we could see a gene-environment exposure interaction, at least I think it suggests we should look at it. It also indicates that because of the earlier studies, they just sort of looked at PON 1 in general, comparing cases to controls or deployed to non-deployed. That's not where the story is. as I said, if you have a genotype that puts you at increased risk for exposure to certain chemicals, people who aren't exposed to those chemicals will not be at increased risk. So there's only an interaction effect that you want to find here. You can't just sort of cross it off the list because you don't see any difference between cases and controls or between deployed and non-deployed. It's really about subgroups, as it so often is in Gulf War illness research. So, just a word of caution that we want to always evaluate the subgroups of importance, and also the general idea that this kind of approach is more useful and more informative than just the more generic comparisons between cases and controls. Okay, so that's the whole of the story. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I missed the very start. Was that a subgroup of your neutralized population? Or
No, it's a whole different group. This was this highly exposed group that was all forward deployed, all Army, all enlisted. They had all the risk factors for Gulf War illness.
So do you have any idea yet if PON1 might account for the 90% that had been?
Or, here's the real odd thing. For some of these veterans, we had both genotypes evaluated, and it looks like PON1 and butyrocholesterol are not independent, at least in our.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I'm sorry, yeah. So, yeah, they may account for the other 90%. They may also have a second-degree interaction because it appears that PON1 genotype may not be independent of butyrocholesterol genotype. We don't really know. So Dr. Lockridge, who studies this kind of thing all the time, she just said, no one has ever looked at that. No one would ever think to look at that. So we don't know either. Just a minute, we have to wait till we get to the committee.
So we
So,
have,
I have a
yes.
I'm sorry, I have a comment that parallels what you mentioned about butyrylcholinesterase being depressed in the setting of pesticides, which is that peroxidase is transported on HDL, which is depressed in settings of oxidative stress. And so peroxidase can also be lower due to other exposures, which may have been a factor in the Persian Gulf. Also a comment on the Magnus paper, if you actually do a chi-squared on their genetic sample, there are statistically significant differences between the different groups and between the different genetic groups and traits. I have, it was years ago that I did this, if I recall correctly, which I may not. I think it may have actually been the case that the heterozygotes were the ones that were more protected, which could be hypothesized in settings if there were sort of small exposures to both nerve agent and pesticide. If you were missing the protective factor against either one, there might have been a problem. So like you, I concluded that it was really important to understand the gene-environment interaction because the different genetic profiles, differently confer relative protection against different exposures that personnel were exposed to. And a final comment, I think you undersold your study by saying it was too small, and I think this was highlighted by the comments that asked what the appropriately powered study would be. And as you mentioned, arguably yours is overpowered as the p-values reflect. But if you wanted to add a little bit of credibility, you could actually do something like a split halves analysis in your own data to see if the findings appear to be replicated within samples.
That's a good idea. But yes, it certainly was significantly powered to identify significant difference.
Lee, just to expand on what Beatrice was saying in your comments, I think the important thing that you mentioned is it's not only having the genetic vulnerability, because without looking at the exposure, we really know nothing. And it's really the exposure genetic outcome is really, that interaction is really, really key. And I think it was nice that you went over the early papers that did not look at that. And you said, it's sort of a mishmash, we don't really know what's happening here because they didn't do that in those papers. And that's why I think what you've done is just so important. And I think this may be one of those really strong recommendations the committee might think about making is, these studies should not just look at genetic vulnerability, we should look at gene exposure outcomes. Because I think you've shown that this is really much more powerful.
And I'll say on the other side, I think we won't know really about the effects of exposures unless we look at genes. So it's a two-way street. We'll know about the exposure effects if we look at genes. We'll know about gene effects if we also look at genes.
Another comment about gene regulation. We presented something, a smaller sample that would suggest the signaling pathways that would activate hormone are downregulated. So the question then comes when you have an observation like this, in a very practical way, are the day-to-day exposures our veterans are now exposed to 25 years later still playing a role in the persistence of their illness? And is there anything one can do about that? Is there a way to affect the gene environment in a way to promote the detoxification pathways or to change the picture in a way that could be helpful?
Do you have thoughts about that, or you just?
I'm bringing that up as a point because I have a patient, we presented a paper on the naphthalene pathway being downregulated, a very important pathway. It is to do with detoxification of gasoline, for instance. Naphthalene is mothballs. So in a very practical way, I had a patient that had come through our study, we had identified this pathway as a problem with this particular veteran as well as in the group. He went on vacation to his in-laws' house and came back as ill as he'd been in 25 years. And it turned out that there were mothballs in between the drywall in the room that he was staying in, his little naphthalene chamber for him. He was horrifically ill for the next 2 years. And I think that these are cause and effect things you think in a very practical way. What are these observations of the time? You can reduce the risk to active duty personnel by possibly being so personalized as to know their gene expression pathways or their mutations or their SNPs or whatever. Can we, classify a group of warriors going out as these ones aren't going into that environment. This is they don't have that kind of, But the flip side of that is what do we do now? It's been 25 years. And these patients, the very veterans that have these kinds of genetic pathway abnormalities are living in a society that's chemically very toxic. And are there ways that we can advise them, at least advise them, if not nothing else, advise them in ways that could help prevent their day-to-day suffering?
Well, sort of a riff on that is one of the things I find telling about this approach is that it not only applies to Gulf War veterans because of this potential insight into how to manage other potential toxic exposures and also predict people at risk in the active military, veteran, and civilian populations where a lot of people have these exposures. And so I find this compelling, and when you think about the Secretary's comments on finite resources, when we start looking at where we spend and how we spend our research funding into actionable recommendations that we make, you need to consider what we're trying to do, and that's two things. Number one, what do we need for coverage decisions, and number two, what do we need for treatment? And when those treatment research opportunities can extend beyond a target population, in this case Gulf War veterans, to current and future veterans of other conflicts and the civilian population, it's much more compelling to make a case to spend those resources in these types of areas because the scale and scope of potential benefit can justify how you measure out those finite funds.
Excellent point. Thank you, Steve. Just to get back to Dr. Klimas's comments asking about on one issue, there are some actual antioxidants and nutraceuticals that do actually alter PON1 levels. So there is research going on in that area. I don't know if there's that for butyrylcholinesterase.
I don't think so. But one thing that's just really simple that our committee, the previous committee version, discussed over all the years, and I think all veterans here would be able to attest to this. I know, Nancy, you see this in your patients as well, that early on we heard lots of stories of people that came back, but they were sort of symptomatic, but it was only when they had a big pesticide exposure after they got back that they got really sick. We've also heard that from people with ALS. I mean, the very most famous ALS Gulf War patient says that he only started getting symptoms after he was exposed to some massive pesticide exposure after he got back. So, we have debated for a long time whether there could be some basis for recommending that people just avoid exposures to these chemicals so that their symptoms aren't exacerbated. On the other hand, there haven't been any studies to look at this. Some of the early VA doctors who tried to help sick Gulf War veterans put them in chemical sensitivity units and tried to teach them how to live a life with no chemicals, and they reported some success. But there was never really a study, and we never had any evidence on which to base some kind of recommendation like that. So just in terms of the historical context.
You were talking about butyrylcholinesterase being maybe used as a prophylactic or something. there's studies looking at circulating levels of hormone and trying to actually give hormone for that same kind of reason. But also perhaps it's treatment, so that's sort of an interesting thing that Rohan is working on, so I'd be happy to check in with him and see where he's at with that, but I think it's really important.
I was just going to start talking about the chemical sensitivities and just living a life of avoidance on that, because I don't remember the researcher's name right off the top of my head, but when I was at the research facility in Houston, Texas in the mid-90s, 94 or 5, they were doing the multiple chemical sensitivity testings and stuff down there with a bunch of us Gulf War veterans at the time. And I do know that you do have to stay away from certain things, but I also know that you gotta, a lot of the antioxidants stuff, foods that you eat, that has to be higher than that. A lot of the foods and stuff you eat and all that has to be higher in that and the nutrients you have. Dr. Steele knows me from the mid-90s, and I'm not the person I used to be, because I was on the crutches and all that, and I had a lot of neurological problems and that, so life of avoidance, basically staying away from the chlorines in the houses and fragrance and every single thing in the house, like perfumes and fabric softeners and all that makes me sick. And chlorine bleach, which I never bothered me before the war, but did after the war. My wife's perfume that I loved before the war makes me sick. All of that. Grease, I used to fix cars, I can't even be around the grease in a car, the whole 9 yards. There's a complete life of avoidance in that. Pesticides, the whole 9 yards. When you talk about people coming home back from the thing, yeah. And I think there is something there, and why it may be after the war some of that chemical left our system, but I think we're hypersensitive to it. Maybe that's why it perpetuates why we're still sick, and veterans still have sick. That's something that the researcher maybe want to take a closer look at.
Good. So Lee, maybe I could ask a few questions. Are other committee members? Great. It seems to me you've been very conservative in your presentation, and you said this might represent 9% or under 10% of the population, but here you're just referring to the rare genotypes, you recall the West race genotypes, but that is a window into a biologically compelling change in plausibility for pesticide exposure and chronic symptoms, isn't it? So it could be a much larger, and in fact you have trends even in the UU genotypes.
Minor, I would say,
yeah.
Although I wish we had a better ascertainment of exposure for the pesticides. It's hard to really know how much people were exposed to. On that particular large population sample, we didn't ascertain degree of exposure, just yes or no exposure. So people with higher degrees of exposure may very well have also had some interaction we couldn't detect.
So I might run through just a couple of quick questions about this. The first is, how do you seal the deal? How do we make this so that this is an incontrovertible
for both enzymes,
association?
I would say another random sample, large population, in which we have the very best ascertainment of exposures and case status. So we don't want to repeat the mistakes of the earlier PON 1 studies. We want to sort of even clean up the butyrocholinesterase study that I presented if we could by having a larger population, very clean case definition, the optimum that we can do with exposure determination. We know that there are some groups for whom we can characterize pesticides and BB exposures better than others. Sarin exposure is hard to get no matter what, but if you see the same thing, I think that the initial information I presented from the EPI studies, it's not that anyone, PB and pesticides show up in study after study. It's not that any study is perfect, but when you see using different case definitions, different variables to represent the different exposures. When you see 7 out of 7 populations telling you that pyristigmine bromide is a risk factor, in some ways, with more flawed studies, you can use more of them, and then if you keep saying the same thing, then you can believe it.
So
I think on this, we don't have to do, confirmation.
And given that you see it in 13 out of 14 you see a history of fetal kidney use in 13 out of 14 rare genotypes who have the Gulf War symptoms. Is that right? 92%. Do I have that wrong?
No, yeah. I'm not sure exactly what you're referring to.
So
About
table
57% of people in every genetic group said that they used PB. And that's typical of other studies as well, in the 50 to 60% range.
But isn't it 92% who have the rare variants?
No,
in the
it's
Gulf War illness?
It's the other way around. It's probably about 90% who have the normal variants. And maybe you're getting it from the paper where we say,
I'm getting it from the
yes,
paper.
of those who were the rare variants and used pyridostigmine
Exactly.
bromide, I think it was 90%.
Over 90%, all but one. So that should be fairly easy to replicate.
And we saw similar with PON1, that people who used.
And then, so then the second question I had is, why not just sequence the whole gene, sequence the exons and the introns, and let's get the whole range of variants and look
I think
for-
that might be helpful, but if you don't do it in connection with what exposures they have, you're still not.
Oh, obviously.
Yes.
For the audience, the beauty about genetics is
The
that
problem with that, of course, is
doesn't
that for
change.
rare variants, you know, you won't have enough of a sample size for that variant to separately test whether it's an adverse variant.
Sure, but maybe even in the UUs, you will see some rare variants that you've not expected.
That's very possible.
So that would maybe refine it to the max. And if we really want to know which individual in the whole population is more likely to be susceptible to PD, that tells to the person, as opposed to just sort of the more general groups. But at this point now, I don't know, you know, we tend to emphasize information that can help.
And then the last question, I have two more questions, sorry. Myasthenia is a great group, and I don't know if there have ever been any rare variant studies in myasthenic patients who are all taking PB every day. Now, you may need other exposures plus PB to have
I think,
the effect.
Beatrice, didn't your RAND study look at any kind of subgroups of myasthenia patients who didn't
I
tolerate?
think there's a separate issue with myasthenia, which is that among the problems, certainly not the only one that pyridostigmine bromide causes, is chronic, persistent and delayed altered regulation of acetylcholine action. And a lot of that is depressed acetylcholine action. And if you continue taking pyridostigmine bromide, some of that is masked. The other issue is I had at one point looked very carefully at the myasthenia gravis literature, and at that time I found one article on adverse effects, and although they certainly are compatible in character with the kind of problems we see in Gulf War veterans, because essentially this is a life-saving treatment in that group, there's comparatively little attention to those. Essentially, you know, take the drug, you know, live, and have these pesky side effects, don't take it, die. So there just hadn't, at least at the time that I looked, been that much close investigation.
Yeah.
But I think really the bigger issue is that it's like saying, gee, this group of people were exposed to insulin and are doing badly, and then saying, let's look at diabetics who are on insulin. That's a group that may actually be benefiting from the drug because they have an underlying physiology in which administration of that drug is moving their physiology toward normal, whereas when given a different population, it's moving their physiology away from normal.
Yeah, although one might still see some side effects in that group.
Certainly is possible. Yeah, I mean, there certainly could still be gene exposure interactions.
And then the last question that I had, is it the 192 variant of PON1 that's associated with ALS? Bob Brown's blend.
Is it?
In rare cases of ALS, who have a
192?
normal
I'm
mutation. So given that the ALS blip was shortly after the war, have those, is there genetic material, or is there DNA from that population?
Thankfully,
that
yes,
could be
that
looked at?
in the early 2000s, VA established an ALS registry, and it included a number of Gulf War veterans, and Dr. O'Leary was instrumental in getting that going, and we have tissue samples from these folks, and they could be genotyped.
Yeah, Yeah, we'll look at that. We'll clean up the full genome sequences. We've done full genome sequencing on everybody in the registry at this point. And so that's the cleanup of a full genome sequence takes a while. You know, we talk about it's $1,000 genome, $100,000 analysis. So we can certainly look at it.
The great thing here is, though, it's not a needle in a haystack. There are some enzymes to go for because they logically protect us from these chemicals. And they, you know, these two enzymes, for example, are at the top of the list. We don't really just have to look at, you know, a GWAS before we'll know anything. It's hard to sort of interface that with the exposures, I think. So.
Other committee member questions? I'm told by Kim that I have to ask the committee members first. So we can move then to other audience questions. Sir? Yes?
I don't really have.
I'm only allowed to ask it then. I see. Until we have open session, is that correct? So I apologize.
I just have a statement, so.
I think we're going to wait for public comment. Sorry about that. Thank you.
Other comments for Dr. Steele?
You want to write it down?
Yes.
No, that's all right.
Jim Perry.
You know, Dr. Steele, you said that it would be hard to get the ones who were exposed to sarin for your studies. Actually, it's like units like Ron's, Steve's over there that were right up there when they blew up Comacia. That's where you get your people, the ground pounders from the
Yeah, we can identify people who are exposed. It's hard to know who other people who weren't at Comacia, and also who wasn't exposed. As you know, the GAO did this big report a few years ago saying that, you know, potentially all the plumes should be expanded. There were other incidents that other people were likely exposed. So how do we assume who wasn't exposed? You know?
Well, those guys who were carrying the rounds and strapping on the demolitions and were within the 15 kilometers, you know they were definitely exposed. And that's why you would use the people out of the 504th and 505th. The ground pounders were actually at Comacia as the ones who were definitely exposed. There would be no doubt then. The ones within the 20 clicks.
That's true.
At that time frame, then you wouldn't have to worry about those who were downwind who may or may not have been exposed. That's how you do it.
I understand.
For the people in that, okay? And that's why VA should, when they use some of that, they should be looking at those within the 20 click time frames of those people who stepped out of good airplanes in flight.
Thank you for that comment, Jim. I think that's exactly right. You know, even though we may not know exactly who was exposed to sarin, we do have the plumes and with some kind of consistency that we can think, you know, that group was exposed, but we do have groups we know were exposed that were much closer. That's probably the groups we need to focus on in a much bigger way.
Can I follow up on, I'd like to follow up on a comment that Lee Steele made, which I think is very important, which is that these findings don't just underscore the importance of the genes, they underscore the importance of the underlying exposure. And follow on for that is that once you recognize that the exposure is important, it may well be that there are some genetic groups that are less vulnerable, but because of factors like depressed concentrations of the enzymes due to other factors, and because of, you know, genes that we don't know about that may amplify the magnitude of the effect even for those who have to some degree a lesser exposure, one of the important findings from this is simply that the exposures have potential for toxicity, and that probably has relevance to the larger population, not just to the smaller population.
That's very true, Beatrice. Actually, we saw that in our preliminary data that when you compare just PON enzyme activity levels or in cases and controls, the Gulf War illness cases were significantly lower than the Gulf War controls, but they were about the same as the non-deployed controls. So when you start digesting that for a while, it tells you that the controls, the people who were exposed in the war, who didn't get sick, may have been more resilient to the chemical exposures, as opposed to looking for vulnerability factors. We also may need to be considering resilience factors. gets complicated.
And that may get back to circulating levels of some of these things like pond one as well, that we
Yeah.
had to then add into our models. And perhaps butyl estuary circulating as well.
Absolutely.
And that's where it gets back to the issue of the other exposures, which may actually alter the circulating levels.
Absolutely, yeah. I think it's important. I think we need to know more about butyl estuaries.
Lee, thank you so much. It is 11 o'clock. What if we take a 15-minute break? Good. Great. And then we will resume at 11:15 with Dr. Terry's presentation.
I totally agree with
I gotta put it down on note what I plan on asking because it's not.
Yeah, that's got noticed. Save it for the public hearing, I guess.